Alright, so in this lesson of our C course, we're going to talk about getting input from the user. Since in the last lesson we looked at control flow and how we can change what our program does depending on some conditions, let's make some conditions that are dependent on what the user enters into our program. So let's get started. So the first thing that we're going to look at doing is actually getting input from the console. We're going to allow the user to type in something, and then for right now we'll just display it to the screen. So let's take a quick look at how we can do that. So in order to start, we're going to need a string to hold the input, because that's basically the data type that we're going to get back from when the user enters something. So we're going to need to statically have a string of a certain size. So let's start with, say, 100 characters. And then we can use the getS function from the standard library in order to get data from the user. And we can actually just use it like this. So now user input will have the data that our user has entered into our program in it, that we get back from getS, and then for right now let's just display that out to the screen. So just to summarize, basically all we need to do is we have our string to hold the input up to 100 characters. We'll use this getS function from the standard library to get whatever the user types in and assign it back to this user input string, and then we'll just echo it right back. So now we can compile and run this. So at this point you should be able to enter some input into your console, and it gets echoed back. So that's basically a little bit of how we can have user input in our program. So let's look at how we can do some interesting things with that. So now that we can get some input from the user, let's write a really simple program that allows the user to input two numbers and then adds them together and prints out the result. So one of the things that we're going to need to remember is the getS function gets a string from the user. So anything that we type in is going to start as a string or character type. So we're going to need a function to convert that to an integer if we want to get numbers from the user. So we're going to import another header from the standard library. That's standardlib.h, and we'll get a function there that will allow us to convert the strings that the user types in to integer types so that we can add them and then return the result. So first, let's include that library. And the function name is a to I. So we can call it like this. So now that'll give us an integer of whatever the user has entered. And we'll prompt them for a second number. We'll use a to I to convert it again. And then let's store the result of our addition. And then we can print it out. So that's all we should need to do in order to have a program that calculates the result of adding two numbers. We grab two strings from the user using getS. We convert them to integers with a to I. Then we simply add the result here and print that out to the string. So we should be able to make this and run it, make sure everything works properly. So now we can enter our first number, our second number, and it prints out the result of our calculation. So now that we know how to get input from the user, let's take a look at how we can combine what we learned about control flow using if statements based on things that we get from the user in order to create a program that allows multiple kinds of calculations. So let's modify our program to do that. So let's say we want our program to support both addition, multiplication, subtraction, and division. So we're going to need to implement some if statements based on what the user inputs. So let's allow the user to input the appropriate symbol for whatever operation they want. So to do this, we're going to need some conditional statements based on the user's first input. So one important piece of information that we're going to have to take into account when we start writing this program is that we can't just compare strings with the equivalence operator like we've looked at before in control flow. Since strings are basically arrays of characters, we need to compare each individual character. So there's already a built-in C function to do this called strcmp. So we're going to need that function in order to figure out which operation the user wants. So let's grab that from string.h. And from here, we can start writing the basis of this program. Let's create a function that figures out what operation the user wants and returns the result of the calculation. So first we're going to need to figure out what operation. So we can basically use that string compare function that we were talking about like this. So all we're doing here is checking whether the operation code that the user has entered is equal to the plus symbol. We're using a negation operator, that's the exclamation point, because if two strings are equal, our function here will return 0. And so we can use the negation operator to check whether this variable is equal to 0 or not. So all we have to do in the case of this particular if condition is return the addition result of these two numbers. So let's do that. So we can do the same thing for subtraction now. So let's make this condition an else if, though, so that all of them get checked. And the same thing for multiplication. And finally, the same thing for division. And let's add one more else case. If the user enters an invalid operation code, anything that's not in this list, in our final else case, let's just return -1. So that outside of this function, we know that an error has occurred and we can handle it accordingly. So now we can actually use the same general structure that we had before. We'll just need a third character for our operation code. So let's add our first prompt now. And a prompt for our operation. And now let's check to make sure our result is okay. And now you should be able to make and run this program. So as you can see, based on the if statements that we have that are conditional on our operation, our program returns to us the appropriate result for addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. So really quickly, we can look at one other way that we can get input from our users, and that's the command line. So when you run a C program, you can specify command line arguments, and here we're going to take a look at how we can get those command line arguments and use them. We're going to take our same program with our same program structure and change it to work with command line arguments as opposed to getting input from the user with getS. So let's add two parameters to our main function, argc and argv. They'll be the number of arguments that we pass and an array containing the arguments themselves. And so the first parameter, or the first item in argv, will be our program name. But after that, we can get the command line arguments that are specified. So let's replace our characters and getS statements with the command line arguments that we pass. So we're going to need to change these to be pointers so that we can hold the arbitrary amount of data as opposed to the fixed length that we had from before. And then we can remove our prompts and getS statements. And essentially leave the rest of our code and everything should work fine. So let's take a look at that. So now we can specify the command line arguments like this. So we're going to add 20 and 2. And as you can see, our program works the exact same way as it did before. Only we enter our arguments from the command line. And that's another way that we can get input from the user. So that's it. We've looked at two of the different ways that you can get user input in C and how you can feed that into your program and write conditional code based on what the user inputs. So that's it.